Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. In the small town of Harrison Creek, routine always seemed peaceful. Residents greeted each other on the streets, children played in the parks, and everyone knew each other. But behind this apparent tranquility, certain truths remained untold for too long. 16-year-old Lila Johnson rolled gently along the mall sidewalk in her wheelchair. Her mobility impairment didn't stop her from facing life with courage and a smile. She carried her backpack filled with notebooks and pencils, ready for a new school year. Her dark skin shone in the afternoon sun, and her eyes reflected both gentleness and determination. A few meters away, Margaret Caldwell, a white woman in her 50s, eyed Lila with contempt. Margaret was known in the city for her arrogance and quick judgments, especially toward people different from her. Seeing Lila, she felt an irrational anger rise within her. Margaret approached, her gaze hard and her lips pursed, ready to humiliate the young girl in front of everyone. Passers-by already sensed that something unpleasant was about to happen, but few dared to intervene. Little did Lila know, innocent and trusting, that this day would change her and Margaret's lives forever. This simple trip to the mall would become the setting for an unexpected life lesson. Lila entered the mall, her wheels rolling smoothly over the shiny tiles. Children laughed in the aisles, and the sweet scent of ice cream wafted through the air. She moved cautiously, peering into the colorful window displays and smiling at the occasional passerby who greeted her. But the moment she passed by a luxury clothing store, a cold, sharp voice called out to her. "Look at this," said Margaret Caldwell, her eyes narrowed in obvious contempt. "What misery, a child who can't walk, thinking she can walk around here as if she belongs in this world." Lila felt her heart sink. She looked up, surprised by such cruelty, but remained calm. Margaret stepped forward again, grabbing Lila's arm with undue force to sway her out of her path. "You should stay home, doing nothing, instead of littering our stores with your presence." Passers-by froze. Some looked away in embarrassment, others murmured to themselves, shocked by the scene. Lila, though vulnerable, did not give in. Her hands clenched on the armrests of her chair, she replied softly. "I'm not bothering anyone, madam. I just want to buy my school things." But Margaret burst out laughing, a cruel, dry laugh that echoed through the mall lobby. "Look at that. Even her voice is arrogant, like she's entitled to something." Lila felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to cry in front of this woman. Her silent courage was already beginning to attract the attention of other witnesses. It was at this moment that a young mall employee, Ethan Parker, approached, frowning. "Hey! Leave her alone. What you're doing is unacceptable." Margaret looked at him, surprised and offended that someone would dare to contradict her. "And who are you? A little clerk who thinks he can give me lessons?" But Ethan didn't back down. He took out his phone and began filming the scene, as passers-by began to whisper and crowd around the confrontation. The tension rose another notch. Margaret felt a pang of worry, but her arrogance was stronger than her fear. She believed her power and status allowed her to crush anyone who stood in her way. What she didn't know was that this moment would soon turn against her. As Margaret continued to belittle Lila, the mall lobby filled with a mix of curious and shocked passers-by. Margaret's cruel laughter echoed unpleasantly off the glass walls. But this time, Lila was no longer alone. Ethan Parker, the brave young employee, stood firmly in front of her. "Enough," he snapped, his voice ringing with determination. "You have no right to talk to someone like that." Margaret frowned, taken aback. "What does that do to you?" "I do what I want." "No, you don't do what you want," Ethan retorted, holding up his phone to film every word and every gesture. "People will see this. You will be held accountable." Around them, several passers-by approached. A mother and her daughter stopped, shocked by Margaret's arrogance. A group of teenagers murmured among themselves, "This is ridiculous, why has no one ever said anything before?" Then a firmer, more measured voice rose from behind the group. "Margaret Caldwell, that's enough. It was Mrs. Thompson, a respected member of the community, known for her commitment to the neighborhood's youth and families. She stepped forward confidently, looking Margaret straight in the eye. "You can continue to humiliate this young girl if you want, but know that we will not remain silent." Margaret's face tightened. For the first time, she felt a real weight of disapproval around her. Passers-by began to murmur aloud, some expressing support for Lila, others openly denouncing Margaret's attitude. Lila, motionless in her chair, watched the scene. She felt a breath of hope. She was no longer alone in the face of this humiliation. Solidarity was manifesting around her, and she understood that courage was not only personal, it could inspire and mobilize others. Margaret, for her part, felt her arrogance waver. She tried a forced smile, but it fooled no one. The social noose was tightening around her, and she was beginning to understand that this public humiliation would backfire on her. The mall lobby was now filled with whispers and curious glances. Passers-by, once hesitant, were moving closer and closer, forming a small circle around Lila and Margaret. The atmosphere had changed. This was no longer just an individual confrontation, it had become a collective act of resistance against injustice. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Lila's shoulder. "You don't deserve this, my dear. Don't let this woman intimidate you." Margaret felt her face flush with anger and shame. She tried to find a word, an attack, but every whisper around her undermined her confidence. Even Ethan, the young employee, didn't back down. He was still filming, documenting the scene so the world could see the truth. Another voice rose from behind the circle, that of Jamal Reed, a local father. "You've crossed the line, Margaret. She's not just a young girl, she's a person with rights. You need to leave." Margaret shook her head, unable to control her irritation. "And who are you to tell me what to do? I can talk to whoever I want." But the community didn't back down. Customers had gathered, some showing their disapproval with gestures, others with words. The murmurs were turning into open criticism. Even employees from neighboring stores were watching, shocked by Margaret's arrogance. Lila, sitting in her chair, felt a strange sense of power. She didn't move, didn't scream, but her mere presence, her dignity intact, seemed to inspire everyone around her to stand up for what was right. Margaret, now isolated and the center of attention, began to lose control. Every attempt to retaliate was drowned out by the collective voices of those who refused to tolerate her behavior. She felt anger turning into humiliation, exactly what she had tried to inflict on Lila. And as the cell phone cameras continued to film, Margaret realized, for the first time, that her actions were no longer hidden. The power she thought she possessed was fading in the face of the community's solidarity and courage. The video Ethan shot began circulating on social media before Margaret even left the mall. The footage clearly showed his arrogance, cruel words, and humiliating treatment of Lila. The post quickly went viral. Hundreds of comments poured in, outrage, support for Lila, and strong condemnation of Margaret. Margaret, back home, turned on her phone and came across the video. Her heart raced as she saw the number of views and shares explode in just a few minutes. Notifications were ticking away at a frightening speed. Her colleagues, friends, and even some family members had seen the scene. Shame overwhelmed her. She still remembered the cruel laughter and whispers in the mall, but now those whispers were multiplied by thousands of voices online. Margaret tried to rationalize, "She's just a young girl, it's not that bad," but the feeling of helplessness wouldn't leave her. The next day, as she went out to do her shopping, Margaret felt the eyes of passers-by fixed on her. Some whispered, others pointed. Even strangers greeted her with implied sarcasm, reminding Margaret that the world had seen what she had done. In her mind, a shift had occurred, she was no longer the invisible aggressor. Every word, every gesture had been documented and broadcast, and she understood that her reputation and social standing were now fragile. Meanwhile, Lila, surrounded by her family and newfound support, received a flood of messages and encouragement. She began to see that her dignity and courage had inspired far more people than she could have imagined. For Margaret, this was the beginning of a long confrontation with herself, the realization that her actions had real, visible, and impossible to ignore consequences. The arrogant woman who thought she had everything under control now had to face the silent anger of those she had humiliated. The tide was turning, and Margaret would soon discover that the humiliation she had inflicted on Lila could backfire on her in the most unexpected ways. A few days after the incident, Margaret stood in her living room, anxious and agitated. The viral video replayed in her head. Every glance from passers-by, every online comment seemed to follow her everywhere. She felt the weight of her actions growing heavier with every moment. Just then the doorbell rang. Margaret frowned. Who would come to her door now? When she opened it, she was surprised to see Lila Johnson accompanied by her parents and Mrs. Thompson, all with calm but firm faces. "Hello, Miss Caldwell," Lila began, her voice soft but full of determination. "We've come to talk about what happened. You've caused harm, and we want you to understand the impact of your words and actions." Margaret stood there, unable to speak. Shame and guilt overwhelmed her. She had expected an angry confrontation, but Lila's dignity and self-control completely disarmed her. "You thought you could humiliate and intimidate me because I'm different," Lila continued, "but here I am, standing, despite everything you've done. Your words haven't broken me." Lila's parents and Mrs. Thompson added calmly, "We are not here for revenge, but to make you understand that your actions have consequences. You need to think about what you have done and how to repair the harm caused." Margaret felt tears well up in her eyes. She had never been confronted with her actions so directly, so honestly. Guilt gnawed at her. I didn't mean to. She stammered, her words trailing off into silence. Lila looked at her carefully, without hatred but firmly. "Your apology alone is not enough, Miss Caldwell. You must understand and take action to ensure this does not happen again." It was a crucial moment, the direct confrontation, when Margaret had to face the reality of her actions and the dignity of her victim. For the first time, she understood that the humiliation she had inflicted on Lila could not be erased by mere words. She had to change, or suffer the lasting consequences. After the confrontation, Margaret returned home with a heavy heart and a tumultuous mind. For the first time, she could no longer ignore the full impact of her actions. Every cruel word, every humiliating gesture toward Lila, came back to her with an almost painful intensity. She spent hours rewatching the video online, reading the comments that denounced her behavior and expressed support for Lila. The messages went beyond mere criticism, they showed the true impact of racism and ignorance on real lives. Margaret felt a mixture of shame, fear, and regret wash over her. That evening, alone in her living room, she thought back to Lila's words, "Your apologies alone are not enough." These words echoed in her head like a truth she could no longer escape. She realized that the dignity and courage of a young girl, despite her disability and vulnerability, had exposed her prejudices and arrogance. The next day, Margaret realized she had to take action to repair the harm she had done. But repair meant more than just apologizing. It meant understanding, changing, and actively supporting those she had hurt. She knew the road would be long and difficult, and that many would remain skeptical of her sincerity. Hesitantly but determinedly, she began looking for ways to make amends. She contacted Mrs. Thompson and offered to participate in community activities supporting youth and people with disabilities. The cautious but open-minded woman from the community agreed to guide and support her through the process. Margaret felt a personal turning point taking place. What she had thought was a simple act of arrogance had become a mirror of her weaknesses and prejudices. For the first time, she understood that the humiliation inflicted on Lila could become a life lesson, not only for her, but for all those who had observed her. Awareness was only the beginning. The real challenge was to come, transforming this shame into concrete and sincere actions. A few weeks later, Margaret shyly showed up at the community center where Lila and Mrs. Thompson organized activities for young people and people with disabilities. Every step was a reminder of her guilt and the humiliation she herself had experienced online. She was greeted by Mrs. Thompson, who eyed Margaret cautiously but without animosity. "Welcome, Margaret. We'll see if you're ready to learn and act, not just say excuses." Margaret nodded, realizing that words were no longer enough. She had to prove her sincerity with concrete actions. She participated in workshops, helping young people paint, play, and organize activities for children in wheelchairs. Every smile she saw on the faces of those she had once ignored or despised touched her deeply. One day, while helping Lila put up decorations for a special event, she whispered, "I didn't know. I never realized how much my words could hurt." Lila smiled softly, without resentment, and replied, "It's not easy to change. But admitting your mistakes is the first step. You can still do something right." For Margaret, these words were a light in the darkness of her guilt. She began to understand that true redemption came not from the immediate forgiveness of others, but from a sincere change in her attitudes and actions. Gradually, the community began to notice her commitment. She no longer sought to dominate or impress, but to serve and support. Every gesture, every smile, every action was a stone laid on the difficult but necessary path of her personal transformation. Margaret understood that this lesson would mark her forever. Humiliating someone never gives real power. Dignity, courage, and solidarity are the true forces that shape lives and inspire respect. As the weeks passed, Margaret's actions began to be noticed. The residents of Harrison Creek, initially skeptical, saw that she was no longer content with just words. She regularly participated in activities for youth and people with disabilities, helping to organize workshops, distribute school supplies, and support families in need. One afternoon, Margaret and Lila were working together on an art project for the local library. Children, some in wheelchairs, some without, laughed and shared stories as they painted murals. Margaret, observing the scene, felt for the first time a genuine, pure satisfaction. She was helping to create an environment where everyone felt accepted and valued. A townsperson, Mrs. Green, approached and said, "I have to admit, Margaret, I never thought I'd see this day. But what you're doing here is real. Thank you for your efforts." Margaret looked down, touched, but aware that there was still a long way to go. Change didn't mean forgetting what had happened, but learning from mistakes and acting for the common good. Lila, sitting in her chair, smiled at Margaret and said, "You see, it's not impossible. Every good deed counts. Every sincere gesture builds trust and hope." Margaret nodded, absorbing every word. For the first time in a long time, she felt useful and aligned with her values. She understood that redemption wasn't an endpoint, but an ongoing process, where every decision could reflect respect and dignity for others. And as she helped the children hang their artwork on the library walls, Margaret knew that, despite her past, she could still contribute to a better world. The lesson from Lila and the community had transformed her heart, and that transformation would guide every action she took in the future. A few months later, the town of Harrison Creek began talking about Margaret's transformation. What had been a viral scandal had now become a story of transformation and redemption. Residents had seen her constant efforts to support youth, families, and people with disabilities. At a back-to-school event at the local library, Lila spoke to the community. "A few months ago, I was humiliated and belittled, and it hurt a lot. But today, we see that change is possible. Even those who do harm can learn and do good." All eyes turned to Margaret, who stood in the room with trembling hands but a sincere heart. The applause began quietly, then grew louder. The townspeople recognized her commitment and her willingness to right her wrongs. For Lila, this moment was a powerful symbol. She had not only overcome humiliation and cruelty, but she had also inspired real change in Margaret's life. Her voice, dignity, and courage had transformed a negative situation into a lesson in hope and action. Margaret, moved to tears, stepped forward and humbly said, "I know my apologies are not enough, but I am committed to continuing to act and support this community. Thank you all for your patience and trust." Lila smiled and replied, "Thank you for listening and changing. It's all we could have hoped for." That day, the city understood that dignity, courage, and solidarity could transform conflicts and even the most closed hearts. Lila and Margaret's story became a living example of resilience and redemption, inspiring everyone to show compassion and respect in their own actions. As the months passed, Lila Johnson continued to shine in her community. Her resilience, kindness, and courage in the face of injustice had become an inspiration to the youth and adults of Harrison Creek. She participated in outreach programs in schools, speaking openly about disability, racism, and mutual respect. As for Margaret Caldwell, her personal transformation was taking hold. The acts of redemption she had undertaken were no longer seen as isolated gestures, but as a sincere and lasting commitment. Every community event she attended demonstrated her commitment to righting her wrongs and supporting those she had once humiliated. Lila and Margaret's story became a powerful symbol in the city, a reminder that even in the darkest times, dignity and solidarity can inspire change. Lila had shown that strength lies not in revenge or hatred, but in the courage to be yourself and stand up for what is right. Margaret, on the other hand, had learned that no social position or privilege gives the right to demean another, and that true greatness lies in humility and service. One day, while walking through the community center, Lila saw Margaret helping a group of children paint a mural. She smiled, feeling that the lesson had been learned. Hate had been transformed into compassion, humiliation into humility, and fear into respect. Thus, the town of Harrison Creek understood a simple but profound truth: dignity and courage have the power to transform not only the lives of those who possess them, but also those who have learned to change. And in this small corner of the world, a young black girl with a disability and a once arrogant woman had together shown that even the most closed hearts can be opened, and that hope can be born where injustice had reigned.